Normandy, late June 1944. The earth shudders from continuous artillery strikes somewhere beyond the horizon, near Saint-Lô. But here, in the deep rear of the Omaha Beach bridgehead, a different atmosphere prevails. In the blood and mud-soaked canvas tent of a massive United States field hospital stands a captive German military doctor, Hauptmann Karl Schröder. On his sleeve is a dirty armband with a red cross, and on his face is an expression of absolute, paralyzing bewilderment. Hauptmann Schröder had spent the last 3 years in the icy hell of the Eastern Front. He expected to see in this American prisoner of war camp exactly what he had seen hundreds of times in Wehrmacht hospitals near Kharkov and Stalingrad. He expected to see rows of groaning, pale soldiers begging for morphine. He expected to see rotting limbs turning black from necrosis. He expected to smell that unmistakable, sweet, and simultaneously sickening odor of gas gangrene, the smell of death, which was the faithful companion of any army in any modern industrial war, the smell which meant that the infection had already devoured muscle tissue and was now slowly killing the man from the inside. But what he sees instead shatters his very understanding of the laws of biology. An American medic, young, tired, with the rolled-up sleeves of his khaki uniform, calmly approaches an American infantryman. Schröder sees the medical chart at the foot of the cot. This soldier's thigh had been literally shattered by German shrapnel 5 days prior. The jagged fragment had pierced the uniform, dragging pieces of dirty fabric, soil, and bacteria deep into the gaping wound. According to every German textbook of field surgery, according to all the bloody years of Wehrmacht experience, this soldier should have already been dead. Death from sepsis would have arrived on the 3rd day. In the best-case scenario, if a German surgeon had grabbed a bone saw in time, the soldier would have lost his leg up to the hip. But the medic does not even glance toward the surgical instruments. Instead of an amputation, he simply injects a syringe of cloudy, yellowish liquid into the infantryman's shoulder. Schröder cannot take his eyes off the patient. The American soldier is breathing evenly. His skin is not covered in the cold, clammy sweat that betrays a deadly fever. There is no high temperature. The wound, which Schröder considers a death sentence, looks clean. The edges are pink. The tissues are recovering without the slightest hint of rot. The German officer doesn't understand what he is looking at. This is impossible. This violates all the rules of a war of attrition. What Hauptmann Schröder did not know, and what no general of the Wehrmacht in Berlin, not even the most brilliant, could imagine in their worst nightmares, was that inside those tiny glass ampules lay the most powerful, most destructive weapon the Allies possessed against Nazi strategy. A weapon produced not in a Krupp steel mill, not forged from iron and gunpowder, but grown from ordinary mold in steel vats on the other side of the world. This was the mold that, by the end of the war, would return 400,000 doomed American and British soldiers to the fight. And while the pride of the German army bled out, rotted in the trenches of Europe, and slowly turned into invalids, the Americans simply cancelled the main rule of war. They learned how to cancel death from infection, and they did it on an industrial scale. To understand the scale of the shock the Germans experienced, one must look at what they believed from the very beginning of the war. The German High Command, the OKW, sincerely believed they possessed the most perfect and technologically advanced war machine in human history. They had heavy Tigers and Panthers tearing through enemy armor. They had superb, murderous artillery. But most importantly, they had the best chemical industry in the world. No other nation on the planet could compare with Germany in the synthesis of chemical compounds. The pharmaceutical giants of the Reich, such as Bayer and the IG Farben conglomerate, provided the Wehrmacht with dozens of synthetic drugs absolutely unavailable to the armies of other nations. German scientists arrogantly considered British and American medicine to be backward. The absolute pride and main trump card of German field medicine were the sulfanilamides, the so-called sulfur drugs. It was a fine white crystalline powder that was generously poured straight from small paper packets into the wounds of soldiers on the battlefield. It was the world's first truly mass-produced chemical antibacterial drug. The Germans believed with holy reverence that this powder was the crown of chemical creation. They considered it the absolute limit of human achievement in the fight against infections. And it must be admitted, up to a certain point, they were absolutely right. In the early years of the war, in the campaigns in France and the first stages of Operation Barbarossa, sulfanilamide did significantly reduce mortality. It suppressed the multiplication of bacteria on the surface of clean wounds. German doctors idolized it, but sulfanilamides had one fatal flaw, which the German generals, blinded by their own propaganda, stubbornly ignored. German doctors accepted the cruel mathematics of industrial conflict as an inevitability. They knew perfectly well that if a heavy bullet or artillery shrapnel pierced a soldier's intestines, tearing the gastrointestinal tract and throwing billions of E. coli bacteria straight into the abdominal cavity, the chances of survival approached absolute zero. 90% of such wounds ended in an agonizing, miserable death from peritonitis over several days. If a red-hot shard of metal drove a piece of dirty wool uniform and a layer of trench mud deep into muscle tissue, severing blood vessels, gas gangrene began immediately. The Clostridium bacteria multiply where there is no oxygen, in dead tissues deep inside the body. Sulfanilamide powder, merely sprinkled on top of a wound, was absolutely powerless against deep pockets of infection hidden in tissues deprived of normal blood circulation. The powder did not penetrate the bloodstream in the necessary concentrations. It only cauterized the surface. German logic was as pragmatic as it was merciless. A severely wounded soldier with a deep internal infection is a lost cause. It is a casualty statistic. The army must move forward without stopping, executing its blitzkriegs, leaving the hopeless in dirty rear hospitals to simply await their fate. From the point of view of the Reich leadership, resources spent on nursing a hopelessly infected soldier were wasted. German military leaders openly laughed at the soft Americans, their concept of saving lives at any cost, and their gigantic medical supply trains trailing behind every United States division. In the Wehrmacht, they believed that war is won with steel, fanatical will, and a readiness for sacrifice, not with clean sheets in hospitals. What they disastrously failed to understand was that in a protracted, total industrial war of attrition, every surviving soldier is not just a saved life. It is a trained veteran who does not need to be drafted anew. It is a man upon whose basic training, equipment, transport across an ocean, and combat coordination one does not need to spend millions of dollars and precious months. Preserving the lives of veterans for the Americans was not simply an act of democratic humanism. It was the cold, calculating, industrial mathematics of victory. The American command understood. An army that returns its wounded to the ranks faster than the enemy ultimately grinds down the enemy's logistics. But to change this relentless math of military tug-of-war, the Americans first needed to defeat an enemy far more ancient and terrifying than the Axis. They needed to defeat microbes, which for millennia had won every battle against humanity. To truly grasp the colossal scale of the American gamble on medicine, one must look back just one generation, return to the mud and madness of the First World War trenches, where the fathers of those soldiers, now landing in Normandy, had fought. In that era, Maxim machine guns and shrapnel shells were merely the vanguard of death. The real, methodical meat grinder began after the battle, on the tables of field surgeons. There is a historical fact that forces one to look differently at the history of warfare. Since the very dawn of civilization, diseases and infections took more soldiers' lives than swords, arrows, or bullets combined. During the American Civil War, the statistics were horrifying. For every soldier who died heroically in battle or from blood loss on the field, 2 died of dysentery, typhus, and gangrene in camp hospitals. Even in 1914, despite the advent of a sepsis, medicine was disastrously powerless. If a grenade fragment shattered your femur or humerus, and the mud from the fields of Flanders got inside the bone marrow, with an almost 100% probability, a staphylococcus or aggressive streptococcus infection would kill you within the first week. The process was agonizing. Bacteria multiplied freely in the blood, poisoning the body with toxins. The temperature jumped to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Delirium began. The pulse became thready. And the best doctors in Europe of that time, standing in splatters of blood, could do absolutely nothing. Their only medicine was a bone saw. They cut off the arm or leg as high as possible, in a desperate, often hopeless, attempt to outrun the spread of the infection through the blood vessels. Amputation in the First World War was not a surgical treatment. It was a gesture of complete scientific despair. By 1939, when the world once again plunged into the darkness of total conflict, generals on both sides of the front perfectly understood the reality. They knew that they were armed with tanks and dive bombers, but medically speaking, they were still sending millions of young men into a literal bacteriological swamp. For the Allies, this problem was not just acute. It threatened to derail the entire military campaign. In 1943 and early 1944, the command of the United States and Great Britain prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Fortress Europe. This was to be the largest amphibious operation in the history of mankind. They planned to throw hundreds of thousands of men across the stormy English Channel and land them on beaches heavily fortified with concrete, barbed wire, and thousands of machine guns. Analysts from the American Department of Defense ran the numbers, and those numbers turned hair gray. They calculated that the kinetic casualties from fierce German resistance on the beaches would be colossal. The first waves of the landing would be literally mowed down. But what frightened Pentagon strategists much more than MG-42 machine guns were the secondary losses. The infectious losses. Generals Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall looked at the maps of Europe and realized a chilling truth. If, as in the First World War, every second wounded infantryman dies of sepsis after being evacuated from the beaches of Normandy to a hospital, the Allied offensive will inevitably drown in blood. Manpower reserves will simply dry up halfway to Berlin. If the wounded do not survive and return to the fight, there will not be enough Allied ships to endlessly bring inexperienced reinforcements from the States and transport hopeless invalids back to England. Logistics will collapse under the sheer weight of rotting wounds. The forces of the anti-Hitler coalition urgently, critically needed a genuine miracle. They needed a drug that would change the rules of the game forever. A drug that would not just suppress infection on the surface, like German sulfanilamide. They needed a weapon that would reside in the soldier's very bloodstream and kill bacteria from the inside, reaching the deepest shrapnel wounds. A weapon that would be absolutely, exterminatingly toxic to the bacterial cell, but completely harmless to the human body. The problem was only that in the darkest hour of the war, in 1941, such an incredible medicine did exist, but it existed only as a tiny brown, foul-smelling stain on the wall of a glass vessel in a cold British laboratory, where even the heating did not reach. And the amount of this medicine in the entire world was measured literally in milligrams, not even enough to cure a single mouse, let alone an invasion army. But the United States, with its unfathomable industrial might, was determined to accomplish the impossible, to turn these laboratory milligrams into thousands of tons, and to do it with such speed that the Third Reich would only have time to realize in terror that the war was lost, not only on land and in the air, but also under the microscope. To truly change the course of the Second World War, one had to begin acting long before the first German units invaded Poland. In September 1928, in the cramped, dusty laboratory of St. Mary's Hospital in London, Alexander Fleming made the most fortunate, most incredible mistake in the entire history of human science. Fleming was not the most meticulous researcher. Leaving for a vacation, he left a stack of laboratory petri dishes containing deadly Staphylococcus bacteria right on the table, open to the winds and drafts. Spores of an ordinary mold, likely blown in from an open window, accidentally fell into one of them. Upon returning, Fleming discovered with surprise that the mold had not just grown. A perfectly clean, transparent zone had formed around the greenish spot. The mold, Penicillium notatum, was defending its territory, secreting a microscopic juice that literally exploded the bacterial cells from the inside. Fleming named this juice penicillin. But for the next 10 years, an entire critical decade before the start of the bloodiest slaughter in history, penicillin remained nothing more than an amusing laboratory curiosity. The reason was brutal. This mold was incredibly, diabolically capricious. Extracting the active substance from it was harder and more expensive than extracting gold from seawater. The penicillin molecule turned out to be extremely unstable. It degraded instantly at the slightest heating, upon contact with acid, or even with a change in the pH level of the solution. Fleming gave up. He was not a chemist. The situation changed radically only in 1939, when Guderian's tanks were already tearing apart the Polish cavalry. Two scientists at Oxford University, the Australian Howard Florey and the German Jewish refugee Ernst Jane, decided that they could turn this unstable mold juice into a real purified medicine. But they began their work at the worst possible moment in the history of the British Empire. Britain was bleeding. The Luftwaffe methodically bombed London during the famous Blitz. The Oxford team lacked literally everything. Their funding was cut. They had no sterile flasks, no proper chemical reagents. In desperation, Florey and Jane began growing mold in enameled hospital bedpans, ordinary glass jam jars, and even old milk cans. The Oxford laboratory resembled a strange alchemical kitchen, cluttered with racks of rotting liquids. The tragedy of their situation reached its peak during the first attempt to save a human being. The patient was a London policeman, Albert Alexander. He had scratched his face on a rose thorn in his garden. Streptococcus and Staphylococcus entered the scratch. The infection was so monstrous that doctors had to remove one of his eyes. His face turned into one continuous purulent wound. Florey and Chain injected him with their tiny reserves of purified penicillin. The result was like a biblical resurrection. Within 24 hours, the temperature dropped. The inflammation retreated. Albert regained consciousness and asked for food. But there was so vanishingly little penicillin in the world that the scientists had to collect Albert's urine, distill it, crystallize it, and extract the drug unprocessed by the kidneys to inject it again. But even this was not enough. On the 5th day, the miraculous medicine ran out. Literally ran out on the entire planet. The bacteria returned with fury, and Albert Alexander died. The death of the policeman became the cruelest lesson for the British. They understood a harsh, undeniable truth of the industrial era. It is not enough to simply discover a medicine. It is not even enough to prove that it works. To save an army, you must produce it in quantities sufficient to cover a global conflict. And that meant the inevitable transition from glass laboratory flasks to steel industrial tanks. In 1941, Britain, exhausted by war and bombings, simply could not physically afford research of such scale. All factories had been converted to the production of tanks and aircraft. And so, Howard Florey, taking with him several test tubes of mold as insurance and rubbing the spores directly into the lining of his coat in case the plane was shot down, flew across the ocean. He headed to the only place on Earth where a problem of such titanic industrial scale could be solved: the United States of America. The Americans did not laugh at the raw British project. The United States War Department quickly realized the potential. They saw in this British mold a strategic resource capable of winning a world war. The United States Department of Agriculture Laboratory, located in the industrial city of Peoria, Illinois, unexpectedly became the epicenter for the creation of a microscopic biological bomb, the center of the most advanced fermentation technologies in the world. But American technologists immediately faced an insurmountable obstacle. Fleming's original strain of mold yielded a disastrously low output of the drug. It was suitable for a test tube, but not for a factory. The Americans needed a super mold. The government issued an unprecedented order. They instructed Army aviation pilots to bring back soil samples from airfields all over the world. They appealed to farmers. Packages with rotten cheese, moldy bread, and spoiled fruit poured into the laboratory in droves. Surprisingly, the winner was found not in the exotic jungles of Africa, but at a local market in that very same Peoria. A laboratory assistant, Mary Hunt, brought a rotten cantaloupe to the laboratory, covered with a strange golden mold. This strain, named Penicillium chrysogenum, turned out to be a true genetic jackpot. It produced 200 times more penicillin than the British original. But how to grow this superorganism on the scale necessary to supply an army of millions? The fact is that the mold grew exclusively on the surface of the fermentation liquid. It required constant access to oxygen from the air. To produce a batch of medicine using the surface method required millions of flat glass bottles. This was a logistical and manual nightmare, incompatible with wartime speed. American chemical engineers solved the biological problem with their inherent industrial violence. If the capricious mold needs oxygen on the surface, they reasoned, then we will blow tons of sterile air through enormous 3-story vats of agitated liquid. We will force it to breathe underwater. This revolutionary method was called deep tank fermentation. Pharmaceutical giants, the chemical corporations Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb, using deep fermentation technology originally developed for the production of citric acid, rebuilt their factories. But this was incredibly risky. The risk lay in the balance. The environment in a 10-ton boiler was the ideal food, not only for penicillin, but for any wild bacteria. One stray bacterium entering this vat through the ventilation system could multiply in hours and devour, kill the entire colony of mold. American engineers had to invent from scratch industrial sterilization and air filtration systems that simply had not existed in any industry before. The first real harsh test of mass-produced penicillin on United States soil was not a battlefield in Europe, but a terrifying civilian tragedy. In the late autumn of 1942, a terrible fire at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston claimed the lives of hundreds of people. Hospitals were overflowing with victims of second and third-degree burns. Burned, exposed flesh is an ideal, defenseless environment for deadly staphylococcus. Before this day, most such patients died not from the fire itself, but from inevitable infection in the following weeks. The United States government took an unprecedented step. They seized all the experimental, tiny reserves of penicillin located in the country and sent them to Boston. The medicine worked. It worked so frighteningly effectively that experienced surgeons could not believe their own records. Burned flesh, which should have inevitably rotted, remained clean and healed. Deadly infections retreated in hours, not weeks. The pus literally disappeared before their eyes. From that specific moment, penicillin acquired a status in the United States completely comparable to the Manhattan Project for creating the nuclear bomb. The War Department completely classified any information about the drug, removed mentions of it from the scientific press, and took firm control over all production. Every ampule was strictly accounted for. Every dose was guarded by the military police. German intelligence and scientists of the Reich knew perfectly well about penicillin from Fleming's pre-war open publications, but they completely rejected it. The leading chemists of the Wehrmacht arrogantly believed that a biological drug was too unstable, unbearably difficult, and expensive to produce, and that it could never replace their beloved, cheap-to-produce sulfanilamides. German blind confidence in their absolute chemical superiority played the cruelest joke on them in the history of wars. They categorically failed to account for the limitless capabilities of American heavy industry. The scale of the American production surge was mind-boggling. Even in early 1943, barely 400 million units of penicillin were produced in the entire United States, a volume sufficient to treat fewer than 100 people a month. In response, the United States War Production Board declared penicillin the #1 national priority, officially placing the task of creating it above the atomic bomb program and the B-29 strategic bomber program. Competing pharmaceutical companies were ordered to immediately share their classified commercial patents, strains, and technologies in the name of saving the nation. Those who tried to refuse or withhold fermentation secrets risked having their factories confiscated by government troops. The American government poured tens of millions of dollars into 21 chemical companies. New factories were built in a matter of weeks. Production lines began operating around the clock. Thousands of female laboratory technicians in sterile gowns, engineers, leading chemists, and mycologists worked in 3 shifts without leaving the shops. The level of secrecy and paranoid cleanliness in these pharmaceutical factories surpassed anything humanity had ever built before. Each produced batch of the drug absolutely passed testing on live mice before receiving an army marking. The results of this shift staggered the imagination. By March 1944, production had grown astronomically to 40 billion units a month, and by June 1944, the very month of the Normandy landings, American factories were throwing 115 billion units of yellow magic onto the conveyor. It was a logistical and industrial explosion unprecedented in history. The Americans achieved what the best German scientists of the Reich officially deemed technically impossible. The Allies now had enough of this biological magic bullet to generously supply every combat division, every company preparing to attack the impregnable fortress Europe. The stakes in the spring of 1944 were higher than ever before in the entire war. The greatest strike armada in the history of mankind was gathered in the south of England. Hundreds of thousands of young American, British, and Canadian boys with tense faces waited for the order to cross the stormy English Channel. On the French shore, in the concrete pillboxes of Omaha Beach, German machine gunners were already carefully oiling and loading their deadly MG-42s, preparing to bleed these amateurs from across the ocean. But in the canvas military backpacks of American Army medics, next to the morphine in syrettes and ordinary bandages, now for the first time lay tiny glass vials of powder. These small bottles were preparing, before the eyes of the entire Reich, to change the very fundamental mathematics of survival on the battlefield. The Germans, dug into the hills of Normandy, expected a grandiose bloodbath. They expected corpses. The Americans, however, brought immortality with them. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the main decisive gambit of the Allies. What happened on the windswept beaches of Normandy under the code names Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword went down in textbooks forever as the most ambitious and bloodiest amphibious operation of all time. The sky was black with anti-aircraft fire. The water turned red, and the deafening roar of naval artillery mingled with the continuous stutter of German machine guns. But behind the line of fire, literally a few dozen meters from the squall of MG-42 lead rain, another, invisible, but no less important revolution was taking place. A revolution that forever changed the face of modern war. Combat medics of the United States Army, landing with the first and second waves of assault infantry, carried in their heavy canvas bags not only ordinary bandages, not only morphine in syrettes and good old sulfanilamide. For the first time in the history of human battles, frontline medics carried penicillin right to the line of contact. The drug in 1944 was not yet as stable as it is today. American pharmacists had developed a special, ingenious field system. The crystalline penicillin powder was in one vial, and the sterile water for injection in another ampule. Under hurricane fire, the medic had to break the ampule, mix the liquids, and inject the wounded man. And they did it. They injected it into boys with torn abdomens and shattered thighs right in the wet, salty sand of the Omaha sector. German artillerymen firing on the coastline from the impregnable concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall methodically kept statistics. They were absolutely certain every severely wounded American soldier who fell on the beach was a corpse. If the American did not die from blood loss right then, burying himself in the sand, he would inevitably die from peritonitis and sepsis on a hospital ship 2 or 3 days later. German doctrine did not envision any other outcome for such massive shrapnel trauma, but they were fatally mistaken. 48 hours after the landing, when the first transport ships converted into floating hospitals moored in the ports of southern England, medical statistics showed numbers that took the breath away from commands on both sides of the English Channel. Penicillin, administered in the first hours of the assault, blocked the development of infection at the most critical moment. The deadly Staphylococcus aureus bacteria that entered the bloodstream, along with rusty shrapnel and dirty Normandy sand, simply dissolved. The bacterial cells swelled and burst. The medical miracle, painstakingly created in the giant steel fermentation vats of the Peoria and Brooklyn factories, showed its true fangs in real, large-scale combat for the first time. To fully grasp the scale of this strategic turning point, one must look closely at the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of war. Let us compare two historical eras. In the First World War, the mortality rate from bacterial pneumonia among Entente soldiers in the trenches of the Somme was a staggering 18%. Every fifth soldier who caught pneumonia went home in a zinc coffin. By mid-1944, the massive use of penicillin in the United States Army had reduced that figure to 1%. During the positional battles of the First World War, the mortality rate from severe open fractures of the limbs complicated by gas gangrene exceeded 30%. With penicillin in Allied field hospitals, 96% of the severely wounded survived. But for Pentagon strategists, it was not just about humanism and basic survival. It was about the speed of returning soldiers to the ranks. And this factor became a nightmare for the German General Staff. A Wehrmacht soldier who received a deep shrapnel wound somewhere near Caen, if he was lucky enough to survive gas gangrene, spent 4 to 6 long months in a rear hospital, and very often was discharged and invalid, limping due to osteomyelitis. An American soldier with a similar wound, having promptly received a massive dose of intravenous penicillin in the invasion flotilla, could often return to his rifle and the front line in just 3 or 4 weeks. His wound simply cleaned itself and healed, without sucking months of resources from the body to fight pus. For the German army, which by 1944 had been bled dry on the Eastern Front and desperately needed men, this meant logistical and demographic death. Germany was forced to draft 16-year-old teenagers from the Hitler Youth and 50-year-old old men from the Volkssturm to somehow plug the gaping holes on the Western Front. At the exact same time, the American military machine was essentially regenerating its own veterans. They sent battle-hardened, experienced soldiers back into the ranks with incredible speed. It was an asymmetrical, total superiority, a superiority that could not be offset by either the newest heavy King Tiger tanks or the world's first Me-262 jet fighters. America won the battle at the cellular level. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes forest on the border of Belgium and Germany. Adolf Hitler throws his last, most combat-ready and heavily armed SS Panzer divisions into a massive, desperate counter-offensive through the dense, snow-covered forests. The temperature drops below -20 degrees Celsius. A blizzard buries the roads. Under such extreme conditions, any serious wound means certain, agonizing death. Frostbite and gas gangrene develop rapidly under the dirty, frozen bandages of the soldiers. German forward field hospitals quickly turned into medieval torture chambers. The pride of the German chemical industry, sulfanilamide powder, simply froze. Wehrmacht doctors had almost nothing but surgical saws and bandages. The smell of necrosis and rotting flesh in the damp bunkers drove even the most hardened, gray-haired veterans of the Eastern Front mad. On the other side of the front line, completely surrounded in the Belgian town of Bastogne, American paratroopers from the famous 101st Airborne Division fought a desperate, unequal battle for survival. They were running out of ammunition for their Garens, winter clothing, food, and bandages. Their medics were on the verge of despair. But at the most critical moment of the siege, when the sky cleared briefly, C-47 transport planes dropped them crates via cargo parachute that, under those conditions, were worth more than pure gold. It was penicillin. The situation unfolded into an absolutely surreal contrast. The German army literally rotted alive in icy trenches, losing soldiers to trivial scratches, while the completely surrounded, frozen American group, deprived of heavy artillery cover, saved its severely wounded, stopping sepsis and bringing the boys back to life right under mortar fire. When German forward assault detachments began capturing smashed American medical posts, they found empty glass ampules with English lettering. By early 1945, grim, morale-crushing rumors began to crawl among Wehrmacht doctors and officers. They finally realized that the enemy possessed a biological weapon of salvation, a weapon that the Third Reich was incapable of reproducing. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe ended in the total collapse of Nazi Germany, when Allied troops and intelligence officers began systematic interrogations of the senior officer corps, scientists, and chief medical officials of the Wehrmacht. The incredible truth about their moral and strategic defeat began to emerge. German military doctors admitted during interrogations the main shock for them in the final months of the war was not the massive carpet bombing by American B-17 flying fortresses that turned their cities to ash, and not the tens of thousands of Sherman tanks that swarmed the fields of Europe like locusts. The main shock for the German medics was how the captured American soldiers looked in the infirmaries. They looked physiologically too healthy. Their terrible jagged shrapnel wounds healed with frightening, unnatural speed. There was no infection in them. The chief medical inspector of the Wehrmacht, Professor Siegfried Handloser, gloomily admitted during a post-war tribunal that the German reliance exclusively on synthetic chemical sulfanilamides was a fatal, fundamental strategic failure. And this failure became obvious in the face of the American biological miracle. For many years, high-ranking German generals contemptuously laughed at the Allied logistical columns jammed with, as they said, soft medical garbage. But this very garbage, produced in the factories of Brooklyn and Illinois, turned out to be the ultimate death sentence for the Thousand-Year Reich. The Americans did not just crush them with superior tonnage of naval steel and bombs. They outplayed the Nazis in their own, most sacred ideological sphere, in the concept of the survival of the strong. Nazi ideology idolized the death of the weak. American industry simply made absolutely all of its citizens strong. The war ended. The roar of tens of thousands of tank engines faded across Europe. The heavy 88mm guns and machine guns fell silent. The dust settled on the ruins of Berlin. But the silence that descended in the hospitals and infirmaries throughout the liberated world was even louder and more significant than any artillery salvos. This silence consisted of the sound of the slow, calm, and even breathing of tens of thousands of young men, people who, according to all the ruthless laws of previous millennia of human history, according to the mathematics of all world wars, were guaranteed to die in the very first week after landing on a beach or in the snow of the Ardennes. A random mold spore blown into an open window and landing in a petri dish in a damp, unheated London laboratory was transformed by American industrial violence into a giant global industry. And this industry forever, irrevocably changed humanity's relationship with death. What Hauptmann Karl Schroeder, in that dirty medical tent in Normandy in the summer of 1944, did not know was that he was looking not just at the end of German military superiority in Europe. He was looking at an ordinary yellowish liquid, laying the foundation for an entirely new world.